Hello and welcome to this year's Geodict user meeting. My name is Ilona Klatt. I'm the business unit manager for fuel cells and for batteries at Math2Market. I studied physics in Darmstadt and I did my PhD later on in Mainz. After a short postdoc, I moved to Math2Market, where I started in my current position, although the team has grown quite a bit. In the business and fuel cells division, we naturally look at batteries and fuel cells. So I would first like to explain a little bit what is a fuel cell and what is a battery. Let's start with a fuel cell. Well, a fuel cell generates electricity by converting oxygen and hydrogen into water. Oxygen is introduced into the gas channels on one side and hydrogen on the other side. The gases then diffuse on both sides through the gas diffusion layer, the GDL, and then through the microporous layer, the MPL. In the MPL, the flow is slowed down so that the gases can then meet the catalyst, which is in the catalyst layer. It's usually platinum, and that is where the reactions take place. That means on the anode side, the hydrogen is separated from its electron, and on the cathode side, the H+ ion and the O2 and the electron react again to form water. The resulting water must now be removed from the fuel cell or from the MPL catalyst layer and also from the GDL. What are the resulting challenges for the material? Well, first of all, the transport of the gases and the transport of the water must function well. For this, the diffusion properties of the materials, the electrical conductivity and also the thermal conductivity play an important role. And the procedure takes place at rather high temperatures. This is why it's also challenging for the material, and also there's a relatively high pressure during operation. This is why also aging is one of the most important aspects for the research of fuel cell materials. In lithium-ion batteries, the lithium ions are initially stored in the active material on the cathode side. And if you start charging the battery, the electrons move to the anode side, driven by an external electrical voltage. To get to the current collector, the electrons can in principle move through the active material where they are already stored, but the active material is in general not a very good conductor electrically. Therefore, we have the so-called carbon black and binder phase, which is usually added, which does conduct electrons well. The carbon black and binder phase has the additional advantage that it not only conducts electrons well, but it's also porous, so that it allows lithium ions to pass through it into the electrolyte. In the electrolyte, the ions are transported in a dissolved form to and through the separator to the anode side. On the anode side, they reconnect with their electrons and are intercalated in the active material, which most often is graphite. Here, as also for the electrolysis, the transport of the species is a key aspect for the material design. Just like in a city, traffic jams and poorly organized transport systems are very unfavorable for the performance, for the capability of fast charging, or for the lifetime of the battery. So, what can you do to improve on these materials, to actually start designing materials? Using Geodict, there's a typical workflow to improve the microstructure of the materials and to design also new materials. Most commonly, one starts with an existing material and takes a 3D scan of it. This can either be a CT scan or a FIB-SEM scan or synchrotron, depending mainly on the resolution that you need for the problem that you want to solve. The resulting 3D scan is usually a stack of 2D images, gray value images, like the one shown here in the import. You can then use Geodict to identify the individual material phases and import the whole structure into Geodict. Then you have a digital model of your original material. This is then also called a digital twin. Once you have a digital twin, you can start to analyze it. You can look at the pore sizes or the grain sizes, the porosity, the distribution of the pore sizes, or you can, for example, calculate conductivities or diffusivities or tortuosities of your material. In the next step, you would want to recreate your material in a statistical sense. That might sound a bit complicated, but it's actually not really. You can imagine it as different patches of the same carpet. Each patch has the same macroscopic properties like fluffiness or color or haptic and so on. In each patch, the individual fibers are different. Each fiber has its own location, its own length, its own diameter, etc. In a statistical sense, the length, the diameters and so on of the fibers are identical in each patch. And in each patch, the distribution of the lengths and the distribution of the fiber diameters, etc. is identical. This leads also to identical fluffiness of the single patches of the carpet, and the single patches of the carpet is what we would call a statistical digital twin, as it resembles the original material statistically. After that, one can start altering the microstructure to result in desired macroscopic properties. For example, you could use longer fibers to get a higher fluffiness of the carpet. This is what we would call designing the microstructure. The most promising designs of the microstructure can then be designated as digital prototypes. With these digital prototypes, one has a good pre-selection and can carry out the quite expensive and complex laboratory experiments in a more targeted manner. In the following, I would like to go into more detail about the individual steps of this workflow. We start with the first step, the import. I will show two examples. Above is a scan of a gas diffusion layer from a fuel cell, and below is a scan of a graphite anode from a lithium-ion battery. These two scans look very differently. At the top, you can clearly see the light-colored fibers with a binder in between, which is also light-colored, and the dark pore. At the bottom, you can see more or less arbitrarily shaped grains. And because these scans are so different, there are two different approaches for the segmentation. In the upper case, one can simply assign a fixed material phase to lighter gray values and another to darker values. This can even be done automatically via a threshold value of the gray values. The result looks like that. In the lower case, this does not work quite as well because the darker gray values representing the pore can also be found within the lighter active material. So using the threshold method would result in artifacts. A better approach is to use the AI segmentation, which is available in GeoDict. To do this, you first roughly mark the material phases in different colors on some of the 2D slices, just like that. Then you feed this information to train a neural network. This network can now be used to segment the scan, or also to segment a scan of the same type. That allows to segment many scans in a short time by reusing the already trained neural net. In both structures that you see here, we still have a problem. There is a binder phase included in both structures, which is not distinguished from the fibers or from the graphite particles. But we also have a solution. In GeoDict, there is the possibility to separate the binder from the fibers with the help of a neural network. It is also possible to do this for granular structures. In GeoDict 23, we include a neural net which is specially trained to identify binder in graphite structures. If you are interested to learn more about image analysis and segmentation, I would like to point out two more talks and a workshop to deal with the topic and the import of AI in GeoDict. These are available on our homepage related to the user meeting. The next step in the workflow is the analysis of the structure. Here, as an example, we show the analysis of the pores in an anode structure on top. The porosity of this anode is 37%. And in the image shown here, you can see the pores, which have the diameter, which is longer than half of all the pores. So that's called the D50 value. In addition, several tortuosities were determined. And here, the geodesic and the diffusive tortuosity are also shown. In GeoDict, however, it's possible to determine more than 10 different definitions of tortuosities. Another example is shown below on the left. Here, the grains were analyzed. For this purpose, each grain was identified as an individual object. Then, their size distribution, the shape, and the orientation of the grains were calculated. Furthermore, physical quantities of a structure can be analyzed in GeoDict. As an example, on the bottom on the right is shown the calculation of the electrical conductivity of a gas diffusion layer. As an input, two things are needed. First, one needs the geometry of the structure. This is given by loading the structure into GeoDict. Second, the conductivities of the individual phases are also needed as an input. Sometimes even contact resistances between the materials are important. These can also be input into GeoDict. The result of this analysis is the conductivity of the entire structure, as well as local result fields in 3D, for example, of the electric current and other fields. The importance of separating individual material phases from each other before analyzing the structure also becomes evident here. You can clearly see it makes a big difference whether one considers the fibers and the binder as one effective material or as two separate materials. Here you can see a few more examples of analysis which are specifically aimed at analyzing fuel cells in this case. On the top left, you see a short video which gives an overview of a GeoDict's capabilities for fuel cell investigation. You can see how the water that forms in the catalyst layer, here shown as an effective material, penetrates into the GDL and then is eventually forced into the gas channel and forms a bubble there. Then the gas flow through the gas channel is simulated, and you can clearly see that this flow of the gas is influenced by the water that had penetrated the GDL and the gas channel. The relative permeabilities for the different saturation stages can also be calculated using Zatodict. With the same module, you can see a study which is shown on the right here, and that was carried out also using Zatodict, and you can see that different fibers with different contact angles to water are saturated here. The simulation results were directly compared to experimental studies of the University in Saarbrücken. On the bottom, you see another study in which the permeability of a gas diffusion layer was simulated for different degrees of compression of the gas diffusion layer. Here, too, the results were directly compared with experimental values. The compression of the GDL and the resulting mechanical stresses and effects can also be simulated directly in GeoDict using the Elastodict module. We have two talks going deeper into this topic: the determination of transport properties of a gas diffusion layer and machine learning for permeability determination of fiber structures. Just as for the fuel cells, here we have some examples of analysis which are particularly interesting for batteries, for lithium-ion batteries. For example, one can examine how the material behaves during lithiation or delithiation. There are different ways of simulating this. Either one builds a battery from two microstructures, an anode and a cathode side, or two current collectors also and a separator. Or the second approach, one examines a half cell. Then the electrode that is not investigated is automatically replaced by a lithium reservoir. In both cases, as a result, you get a charge curve, for example, the potential over the state of charge. And you also get locally resolved 3D result fields. For example, the involvement of the lithium ion concentration during the charging, or the electric field, or other interesting fields. Calculating such complex simulations on representative structures is time-consuming and, depending on the solver, also requires a relatively large amount of RAM. If one wants to do parameter studies and alter the microstructure design, this effort may not be possible for all the simulations. For this reason, in GeoDict 2023, we include now a mesoscale charging simulation for both full and also for half cells. For this purpose, the revised best solver of the ITWM, the Fraunhofer Institute for Mathematics, was integrated into GeoDict. The solver is based on a pseudo 3D Newman model, which is much simpler and thus the simulation is much faster. The geometric structure information which is necessary as an input parameter, this information is automatically calculated in GeoDict, which means that you just load your microstructure into GeoDict as usual, and then GeoDict calculates all the necessary input parameters in the background, such as the mean grain size, active surfaces, and everything that you need. Then the mesoscale loading simulation is started automatically, and you directly get the potential charge curve. For particularly promising configurations of the microstructure, you can then run the resolved loading simulation and look at the locally resolved result fields. Another thing that we have newly included in the 2023 version for the charging simulations are the concentration-dependent parameters in the electrolyte. For example, lithium diffusivities or conductivities, so that the lithium diffusivities or conductivities can now depend on the lithium concentration. A very important issue in battery material development is the aging. Aging is not only an important, but also a very complex topic. We have taken one step in the direction of simulating aging. So the simulating of aging is up to now limited to a part of the mechanical aging in GeoDict. You can now simulate stresses which arise during the expansion of the material during charging. This feature is available as an add-on to BatteryDict. Let's move on to the next step of the workflow, namely the reconstruction of a structure in GeoDict, the so-called modeling. Why would you rebuild your structure at all when you already have it available in GeoDict? Well, in order to know how to alter the microstructure in a way that on the macro scale the material behaves as you desire, you first need to know the statistical parameters that define the microstructure. To do this, you can use various modules in GeoDict that give you the material parameters in a statistical sense. You can then use this information to generate many representations of the structure, just as if you were looking at the different pieces of one and the same carpet, if you remember at the beginning at the talk. For granular structures, like battery electrodes, for example, you would use GrainFind and GrainGeo. For fiber structures, like for example a GDL, you would use FiberFind and FiberGeo. Especially for sintered structures, there's a new Geo app in GeoDict 2023 available that makes it much easier to create statistical digital twins of sintered structures, like for example solid oxide fuel cells. Many thanks for this to Philipp Mamet and Loris Holzer. Another extremely useful Geo app in GeoDict 2023 is the optimization app, which allows you to optimize digital twins for certain material properties, like for example the diffusivity. More interesting Geo apps are represented in the talk of my colleague Matthias Fingerle. An example of statistical modeling for fuel cell catalyst layers will be given in the talk by Mehrdad Ahmadi from Johnson Matthey. This talk will follow later in this session here and will not be available online. Of course, not only the geometry is important for a good model, but also the material parameters. So let me point you to the material database of GeoDict, which now includes better references for the materials and recently also allows you to store metadata for the material, which is not used by GeoDict itself, but it can be stored there and eventually be used by other scripts or other software. In the next step of the workflow, we come to the design of microstructures, which is the targeted manipulation. The slide shows a few examples of what is possible here. In the figure above on the left, the binder content and the conductive carbon black content of an NCA and LCO mixed cathode was varied. In this case, it was found that the battery could be charged more easily for lower binder content. Below on the left, another study is shown in which the particles of a graphite anode were manipulated. They were reduced in size and also aligned in charging direction, With this manipulation, the tortuosity of the anode could be massively reduced. This also suggests a better charging behavior of the new anode material. Within the Structure E project, in which we participate, we tried to produce a thick anode that is capable of fast charging. In order to make it fast charging despite its thickness, in the project we tried different approaches to improve the microstructure. Here shown is a perforation of the structure with a laser so that you can get wide paths for diffusion. That means the ions have enough space to diffuse easily, and the diffusion also works well for thick electrodes. Again, you can analyze the resulting structure. Of course, you get a higher porosity for the perforated structure because holes were punched into it. Not so self-evident is the significant decrease of the tortuosity. This, again, suggests a better performance during charging, which has been experimentally confirmed by our project partners. A gas diffusion layer can also be perforated. And though the study on the bottom here is somewhat older, the result still holds true. The simulation of the saturation with water shows that the water fills preferentially the big holes that have been punched. This way, the smaller pores are kept free for the gas transport and the GDL does not clog so quickly. If you want to know more about structure optimization, parameter studies, and automation of the process, let me recommend to you two very interesting workshops, Parameter Studies with GeoPy, for beginners and for advanced users. We have now looked at the entire workflow for material design. At the beginning, we had the import. We looked at how to analyze a structure, what you have to do and take into account when modeling a structure, and how you ultimately design microstructures to get then prototypes and in the end get the next generation material. Here's a short preview of GEODIC 2024. In the coming year, we will concentrate more on all solid-state batteries so that these can also be simulated with GEODIC 2024. So far, we already have a small demonstrator, which you can also play with in GEODIC 2023. And with that, I would like to end my talk and refer to two other also interesting talks that have not yet been mentioned: the possibilities of using GEODIC in the cloud, and how to produce beautiful videos of your result files in GEODIC. Thank you for your attention. I'm still available in the chat now, where you can directly pose all questions to me. Thank you very much.